All right, so when we talk about soybeans and flowering before the solstice, the first thing we got to think about is daylight hours, and it's actually the night length or the inverse of these daylight hours that triggers that flowering. But for the most part today, looking at these slides, we'll talk about day length, but realize it's the inverse, the night length, that actually affects the soybean flowering. So as we look at these four different locations from Effingham up to Mason City, Iowa, we can see that as we go from the spring solstice, where the daylight and night length hours are equal, all the way to the summer solstice, where we've got the longest days and the shortest nights. These four areas start to separate. And that's what drives the different maturity groups and how different maturity groups are developed for those different environments. So we look at a group 4 that would be triggered by 14 hours and 20 minutes of day length. At Mason City, Iowa, that would occur on May 5th. At Ottawa, Illinois on May 9th, Hayworth, Illinois on May 11th, and Effingham on May 14th. If we look at a group 3, that's going to take 20 minutes more day length. So it'll be later in the year, May 14th, May 19th, May 22nd, and May 27th for Effingham. And then go to an earlier season being a group 2, that's going to be triggered by 15 hours of day length or the 9 hours of night length. But Mason City, Iowa, that'd be May 24th. Ottawa, May 31st, Hayworth, June 7th, and Effingham, this is going to happen anytime because we're always going to be shorter than that 15 hours of day length in Effingham. So when we break it down, we realize these are the trigger dates for the different maturities, and we can split those groups in half and look at 3.5s and 2.5s and how they compare. But the other thing we have to keep in mind is the temperature aspect of soybean growth and development. So it's going to take 90 to 120 growing degree units from planting to emergence to get those beans out of the ground. And then to get the leaves, first unifoliate leaves out on the beans, it's going to be an additional 100 growing degree days. So you're looking at about 200 growing degree days or growing degree units from planting to the unifoliate stage. If we just look at from planting to R1, when we get those first flowers, that's going to change based on the maturity groups. So group 4s, just like with corn relative maturities, your 115, 16-day corn is going to take more GDUs to get to flower, to get to maturity. These beans are going to take around 900 to 1,000 growing degree days from planting to R1. Group 3 bean may only take about 800 growing degree days to get from planting to R1. So we've got to think about that. These two dates on here now, we're looking at when is the trigger date. So for a group 4 that's triggered before 15 hours and 20 minutes of day length, at Hayworth, that trigger date is May 11th. But to get the 200 growing degree units with average temperatures at that location, we would have to plant a group 4 bean by April 21st. Effingham, the trigger date's a little bit later because of the latitude, and it's accumulating heat quicker because it's further south. So a group 4 bean would have to be planted by May 1st in order to flower before the solstice. Same thing as we look at these other locations, these different maturity groups, as we get all the way up to Mason City, Iowa, where they're not accumulating those growing degree units as fast early in the season. There's a larger separation between when that bean would have to be planted to get it up and get the unifoliates out before that trigger date. So if we look at Mason City, Iowa, and the opportunity for a group 3 bean to flower before the solstice ends around the 10th of April. So So we've got to have that planted by the 10th, 11th of April. If we don't get that done, you know, we're going to be looking at flowers after the solstice. Drop down to a group 2 bean after that, and as long as we get the average temperatures, you know, we can get that bean to flower before the solstice. The earlier we get it planted in this window or this line on the group 2 maturity, the more nodes we will have and the more beneficial that will be for pods and for yield. At Ottawa, Illinois, Interstate 80 area, they're only going to have about 2-3 days in April where they could plant a group 4 bean and get it to flower before the solstice. You know, the other thing to think about with getting some of these full season beans for different areas, you know, is not just getting them to flower on the front end, but how are they going to mature at the end of the season? So make sure we have a bean that can finish filling out the pods before we run into frost issues. But dropping from a group 4 to a group 3 bean, now our window is extended until about the 27th of April, based on those average temperatures for Ottawa. And then once we get past the 27th, probably not going to flower with those group 3 beans before the solstice. Dropping down to a group 2 bean might allow us to get to again flower before the solstice. Look at Lincoln, Illinois, or Hayworth area. They're at the Crop Tech office. They've got the opportunity to plant group 4s up until about the 20th of April and have them flower before the solstice. Group 3s until about the 5th of May, and then group 2s after that. But again, this is just looking at the goal of flowering before the solstice. So if we take into account some of the yield advantages to full season beans, we could still have a group 3 or a 3-5 that didn't flower before the solstice out yield a group 2 bean that did flower before the solstice. So there's a lot of different things to consider here. We're just trying to chart out this graph of where is the opportunity to get those early flower beans. If we're able to make a switch, if we want to make a switch, if we're going after the early flowers, and we get pushed back because the beginning of April is wet, where could we shift some things around, move some varieties to try to get the early flowering accomplished. Go further south into Effingham, Illinois, Interstate 70 area. Now we've got a larger window for those group 4Os, our group 3Os. We could still plant them up till mid-May and get those early flowers, and then our group 2s after that. Again, realize we could plant group 2s or group 3s all the way back here in April. You know, and some people have had success doing that as long as you have varieties, you know, that will still perform well or outperform those fuller season beans. So you could plant 3Os here in the middle of April, and that's a little bit safer bet in order to get them flowered before the solstice. But another thing to keep in mind is how are you going to spread your maturities and spread your harvest window, or group it together as you see fit. Like we talked about in the podcast, when we get into May and some of the more normal planting dates, usually we'll plant our shorter season beans first, our fuller season beans last. In April, we're usually talking about full season beans first, shorter season beans last, to try to get them all or a majority of them to flower before the solstice. But regardless of what maturity you're planting, the earlier you plant it, the more nodes you're going to have. Because as soon as those unifoliates are out, they're accumulating those nodes based on the heat units. So once every so many heat units, on average about every 4 days, we're going to add another node. So whether we plant on April 10th or April 20th or May 20th, the earlier we plant, the more nodes we'll have. So it's kind of get ahead and you're going to stay ahead. Like I was talking, typically we'll recommend to maximize yield potential of early planted beans, use those mid to full season varieties. They're going to have more nodes the fuller season they are, because it takes them longer to get to R1. So they have more time to add nodes. And that's where some full season beans can catch up and pass shorter season beans in yield because of the total nodes. So our short season maturities, if we're planting them ultra early, we might end up with fewer nodes and shorter plants because we're running through those stages so fast. So if we plant a 2 or a 2.5 in Hayworth that emerges in April, we could actually yield less than a 3.0 or 3.5 that was planted in May due to that. So I hope this helps give you guys an idea of when those dates are to be thinking about if you are going after solely early flowers. If you're trying to capture that, when should you look at starting to switch some things around and maybe bump down your maturity range for that planting date?